Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to Network 2020's discussion about China's grand strategy, what to know about Xi's global ambitions. And this is the last of Network 2020's deep dive on China. So this is our concluding episode. We do have several others that are available on our YouTube channel if you would like to check them out. For those of you who might be joining us for the first time, just a few words about what Network 2020 is. We are a nonprofit organization. We're really an international community that's trying to bridge the gap between the private sector and the international affairs worlds. And so we run a number of programs, including briefings like these, our deep dive programs. We also run in-person events in New York. So please do check us out on social media and follow us to keep the updates coming. So just a few words. I just wanted to say a few words about the title, which I think is an interesting one. I imagine that some people are coming here expecting some answers about what China's grand strategy is. After all, this is something that I think we keep hearing about in the news. I read an article in the Washington Post the other day that summed up this outlook, I think, quite well. And this was after Rishi Sunak's visit. The Washington Post published a piece that said, in response to President Biden's comment about Ukraine, the piece wrote, and this is not a quote from Biden, but just from the piece, that China, a Russian partner with its own aims of world dominance, is watching. He, President Biden, and others have warned. So I think that there's a lot to take issue with in that sentence. It isn't to say that the US shouldn't be concerned about China, but the way in which we express that concern, I think, is very important. And I think if we, the electorate, blithely assumes that China's goal is world domination because that's what we're being told, perhaps that's the policy we might get. So here to explore in a very pragmatic way, looking at the connection between domestic and foreign policy, is Professor Susan Shirk. Professor Shirk is a research professor and chair of the 21st Century China Center at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. She is the author of China, Fragile Superpower, and the Political Logic of Economic Reform in China. From 1997 to 2000, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs, with responsibility for China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Mongolia. So thank you very much for being here, Professor Shirk, and welcome. And here, if you would like to read more, her book, Overreach, How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise, is the winner of the 2023 Lionel Gelbo Prize for the best English language book on international affairs. So please do check that out. So with that, welcome, Professor Shirk.
Well, thanks so much.
Overreach was originally meant to be an update, as I understand, to your 2008 book, China, Fragile Superpower. But ultimately, this became a standalone book. And so I'd just be curious to start off with, what sort of developments and changes occurred in that time that led you to publish an entirely new book?
Well, thanks so much for that question. Writing a book like this always takes much longer than you originally anticipated. And you're right. Originally, the publisher asked me to update Fragile Superpower, which was published in 2008, 7 and 8. And what I observed actually just at that time, 2006, 7, 8, was some changes in China's behavior, its foreign policy behavior, especially, but also its domestic behavior. And the argument of Fragile Superpower was that China's leaders are always highly politically insecure because they weren't elected. They don't really know what people think of them. They have no idea when there might be a public split in the leadership or the public might rise up against them. And this insecurity was particularly acute after the Tiananmen crisis in 1989, when the regime really did come close to collapsing, because you did have a split in the leadership. You had massive protests in more than 130 cities in China for weeks and even months. And only because the military followed Deng Xiaoping's orders to forcibly put down the demonstrations did the People's Republic survive. So after that, the leaders of China have really been worried that something like that could happen again. And of course, it could happen again. What they did, however, in foreign policy is try to pursue a policy of restraint and reassurance in order to maintain a good international environment, international context, to put their emphasis on China's economic development so that people's livelihood would improve and they would be very satisfied with Communist Party rule and not worry so much about their freedoms. And, you know, that worked pretty well. And the focus was on economic development. But when it came to foreign policy, most of it was reassuring and restrained. But in the relationship with Japan, the issue of Taiwan, and to a certain extent with the United States, what you saw was the growth of popular nationalism as China developed a more commercial media, internet. Naturally, these publications wanted bigger audiences. So there was a lot of stirring up of nationalism, but it was focused just on really Japan and Taiwan. So it was really a story about the media, nationalism. That was the main story of Fragile Superpower. But when I looked at the changes in Chinese actions in around 2007, 2008, it didn't seem to be driven by those same factors. This is especially true with the South China Sea. What we saw in the South China Sea, it had not been a hot button issue for the Chinese public. Very little attention paid to China's disputes over who had sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea and over the waters itself. And but then around 2006, 7, 8, we saw Chinese, mostly civilian maritime vessels like fisheries, Coast Guard, marine surveillance. They started shoving around the fishing boats and the cutters from the Southeast Asian claimants, Vietnam, the Philippines in particular. And I couldn't really understand why, what was going on. I knew that they were not being pressured by popular nationalism. So as I went to update Fragile Superpower, I didn't really know, could I be making the same argument and just updating it? I was puzzled what was going on. And so I went off on this quest to find out what was going on in Chinese domestic politics that might be causing this shift. And at the same time, I saw a shift in domestic practices, domestic behavior before the Beijing Olympics, where you saw a real crackdown on society, non-governmental organizations, and the media, as the commercial media and the internet engaged more people. The censorship, which had been relatively light up through about the time of the Olympics, got a lot tighter. And at first I thought this is just about the Olympics, because in China, when you have big events like this, they always tighten up right before, and then afterwards they go back to normal. But in this case, they did not go back to normal. They have not loosened up ever since. So to me, this was the puzzle that motivated me to write Overreach, because this kind of new style of behavior, which I felt was really harmful to China's own interests, I was trying to figure out what was going on that was driving it.
Thank you for taking us on that journey. And I find that the piece about media fascinating. But when it comes to the term overreach, I'm curious if, what do you mean when you say overreach, and how, in your mind, has Xi's administration done so?
Well, the meaning of overreach is not just to behave aggressively, or in the case of domestic politics or domestic social control, more repressively. Overreach, what overreach means is taking things too far in a way that snaps back to harm yourself. So it's self-defeating action is the definition of overreach that you get in many dictionaries, and the one that really resonated with me, because what I saw was that this new style of Chinese behavior was sparking a backlash, an international backlash, but also even a domestic backlash, say from private business and many middle-class people and young people. So that's what I mean by overreach.
Thank you for that. So how did China derail its peaceful rise, as you suggest in the title? What factors led to the turnaround in China's foreign policy, from Deng Xiaoping's dictum of hide your strength, bide your time, to this idea of wolf warrior diplomacy that has gotten quite a bit of press under Xi?
Well, I'm actually a student of comparative politics. I'm not an international relations scholar, even though I did foreign policy in the government, and I'm very concerned about China's relations with the world, and especially the United States. And so the way I start out is by looking inside China and trying to figure out what are the domestic dynamics that might be driving this shift in policy. Because you see this in every political system, every country. I really see foreign policy as just another policy output of a domestic political competition of some sort. And I even like to call the party leaders in China politicians, because although they're not elected, they are constantly maneuvering to advance their own careers and to protect their own personal security. So I started trying to figure out how China's overreach might have begun. And this was really puzzling, because this is a period under Hu Jintao. So one of the big surprising facts about China that I think people will learn when they read my book is that it didn't just all start with Xi Jinping. It actually began under the collective leadership of Hu Jintao. And it was driven by the competition among different interest groups. Hu Jintao was a relatively weak leader. He was quite well-intentioned. He was in the sense that he was trying to strengthen support for the party among the public by making the system more responsive, not having elections, but actually he introduced internal party elections. in order to nominate the leadership. And of course, he was following Deng Xiaoping's advice to try to find a way to have peaceful turnover of power at the top. So Deng introduced term limits, retirement ages, so that after 2 5-year terms, the top leadership would step down and a successor would come into Zhongnan Hai. Now, this was a remarkable achievement. It's really the only communist country that ever managed to achieve this peaceful turnover of power. And yet we see just this past year how Xi Jinping has now abandoned this practice, and he's now in his 3rd term, which he achieved by revising the Constitution. So that's a puzzle. I have a lot in the book that describes how and why collective leadership led to overreach. People are less interested in that today because that's not the problem we have today. By the end of the Hu Jintao era in 2012, actually 5 years before, Xi Jinping won one of these internal informal elections to become the successor. But nobody imagined that he would rule China in this highly centralized dictatorial manner the way he has today. But he was able to make the case that you needed stronger leadership because collective leadership was a good idea in theory, but it wasn't very successful. And for one thing, it led to massive corruption, which was the main argument she made for a more concentrated power system.
It's very interesting, and I'd like to stay on the leadership piece just for a moment too. How do you think that Xi's ambitions and what seems to be a group of loyalists, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that he's elevated to China's top leadership, how do you think that they will shape this, their domestic policy as well as their foreign policy?
Well, I think there's been a lot of focus on Xi Jinping as an individual. Certainly in the United States, we're kind of vilifying Xi. We talk about him as a dictator, which he certainly is. But the reason why China has become more dangerous to the United States and other countries, and why they're struggling with so many internal problems, especially related to the economy, is that this over-concentration of power that Xi Jinping has introduced has led to what Deng Xiaoping said when he was criticizing the Mao system after Mao died. He said over-concentration of power leads to arbitrary decision-making. It leads to mistakes under Mao, like the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. Well, Xi Jinping has been making his own mistakes. And the system leads to overreach because everyone, all the officials under Xi, at every level of the system, going right down to the local governments, are afraid that Xi will go after them if they don't demonstrate how loyal they are. Xi introduced this anti-corruption campaign in 2013, right after coming to power. And this anti-corruption campaign, their corruption had become very endemic, very serious under collective leadership. So the public really supported this effort. But what it turned into was a purge of all the political figures, including very senior ones, who might be rivals to Xi Jinping. And this purge continues to this very day. It's gone after, it's put into jail through party justice, hundreds of thousands of officials. So, and today, some of the targets of this purge are the same people in the security apparatus and the party discipline apparatus who were carrying out the purge. They were the inquisitors in the earlier stages. So it's become what Zbigniew Brzezinski called a permanent purge. So this puts tremendous pressure on all the political officials in the system. And they are striving to show their loyalty to Xi Jinping in order to protect themselves. So to do that, they jump on the bandwagon behind what they believe Xi Jinping's preferences are and carry those out in kind of over-compliance is what I call it, carry it out in a more extreme manner. And they're too afraid to report up the ladder what are the real costs of these policies. So that's how this system generates overreach.
It's interesting. It sounds like in trying to root out one problem, the problem of corruption, Xi traded that for another, which is this lack of good feedback. Could there have been a third way in your mind, with your understanding of the system? Would there be another way to approach this so that he could get results that are, that have a little bit more balance, but without the corruption?
I'm so glad you asked me that question because much of my work, I've learned from Jack Snyder, who's an international relations scholar at Columbia. And he wrote about Germany and Japan, how they self-encircled by their aggressive behavior, creating this fear from other countries. And he described it as being driven by these interest groups. And so that was a clue for me, and I started looking for that. But in China. But what I realized is that, first of all, these interest groups were driving overreach domestically as well as internationally. So overreach was not just a foreign policy phenomenon. So that's a little different from Jack Snyder's work. And then I also realized that it was the particular coalition of interest groups in China that explain the policy outcomes. And actually, it could have been different because and those interest groups were mostly related to internal security and to military, people's armed police, party discipline, and heavy industry, industrial interests. So including, of course, censorship. So I call that group the Control Coalition. And that's the group which really led to overreach in China. But if Hu Jintao had given other groups who had an interest in loosening up, had an interest in good relations with the outside world, like private business, like coastal cities, like the intellectuals, academics, professionals. If he had figured out a way to give them more of a voice in the Chinese policy process, a kind of reform coalition, then yes, I think things could have been different. So what would it have taken to do that? I think it probably would have taken, and this is the argument I make in the book, that they'd have to go a little further than what Deng Xiaoping had introduced. In other words, you really can't rely on the institutions just within the Communist Party to check the overconcentration of authority. You have to have a legislature, and you could have brought in the private business through the legislature. Remember John Zeman back in the 90s, he had this idea of 3 represents, of bringing more of private business into the party, but in the end, it turned out to be very minimal number of private business people coming into positions of authority within the party. So I think it would have taken a more independent legislature and legal system to change the balance, the internal balance in China, and enable them to sustain this more responsible, restrained foreign policy.
Thank you for answering that. I appreciate it. So, just sticking with this connection between the domestic situation and foreign policy, how, when you're looking at China's domestic situation right now, how in your mind is it playing into its foreign policy aspirations? What's the relationship between the two, and how do you see Xi prioritizing, among that panoply of policy needs? How do you see him prioritizing?
Well, it's certainly true that Xi Jinping is a more ambitious leader for China's role in the world. And, some of this does come just from China having a bigger economy than it did before, having more capabilities. So some of it is just that China is rising in power. But some of it is also Xi Jinping's own ambitions. And also, I think he believes that he can maintain his own popularity by showing that China really has become not just a regional leader, but a global leader as well. But, I have always assumed that China would become more ambitious over time, because it's a major power, and it has a historical legacy of being a very powerful country. And, frankly, from the standpoint of America, I don't really see any problems with China becoming a leading country in the world and being ambitious. And there are many people in China I've talked with who have a vision of how China could achieve its ambitions in a peaceful way. And that had been the way they'd been doing it up until the mid-2000s. So what does that mean? That means trade agreements. And China is now the largest trading partner of more countries in the world than any other country. So economic integration, China's soft power. China has a tremendous historical and cultural legacy. China has a lot of smart people and can achieve a lot of great things, like its space program, going to the moon, its achievements in biotech. There are a lot of ways that China can achieve its ambitions in ways that are compatible with the interests of other countries. I think, but she went beyond that. Some of it was economic diplomacy, which was pretty successful, frankly. The Belt and Road Initiative, which is a kind of prestige program for Xi Jinping. If other countries welcome the loans, they want the infrastructure, they need the infrastructure, they see opportunities for their own people to participate in the projects, then I think that's all well and good. And I always felt that it would be a mistake for the US to oppose it per se. But one of the problems was that the way the Chinese did it was to monopolize all the contracts, all the economic opportunities. It didn't open it up to companies from other countries, including the host country. So, it was, and the expectations of the host country were that they followed Chinese political dogma, especially related to these domestic issues related to Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, etc. So, and then she largely, in order to maintain his support from the military, which is, of course, essential for any autocratic leader, he really beefed up the military and allowed the military, as well as civilian forces, to really start pushing its neighbors around in the South China Sea, the East China Sea with Japan, more aggressive behavior in the Taiwan Strait toward Taiwan, and then economic coercion toward Australia, sanctions toward Australia when they called for investigation, international scientific research on the origins of COVID, the pressure, the punishment of South Korea. They even stopped buying Norwegian salmon and other exports for years when the Nobel Prize was given to a democratic dissident from China. So this kind of behavior made enemies, not friends. And it showed Xi's poor judgment. And yet, in this type of system, people felt that they had to fall into line, which is why you see this wolf warrior diplomacy. I mean, Wang Yi, who is now the senior most foreign policy official in China, is someone I know very well for many years. He's a person I wrote about in Fragile Superpower as the architect of China's very effective regional strategy, making lots of friends in Asia. But now he turned into a wolf warrior. So what I'm watching to see is, I know that he sees the backlash. Xi Jinping might not be aware of how strong the backlash against China's overreach is. But I know that Wang Yi understands it. And I'm watching to see whether or not he might be able to craft a more moderate Chinese foreign policy. He might be able to convince Xi Jinping that actually he and China would benefit from revising this wolf warrior diplomacy.
Thank you. I'm curious. I just wanted to pick up one small point in that, with all of the examples that you gave of how some of the foreign policy, particularly when it came to Belt and Road, has made more enemies than friends. When it comes to the contracts, do you think that was that done as a strategic decision not to open it up to other countries, including the host country, or do you think it was just a product of the system from which China emerged, that was just sort of how it's been done?
The latter. I
Okay.
think bidding, open markets, sharing the benefits with companies from other countries, that's not something that's been the practice in the past. Although, of course, China did open up its market and go from central planning to a market economy, but the part of the Overreach story is that by 2006, the Chinese central government is reclaiming its dominant power over the economy. And we see today how that continues. State-owned enterprises continue to be kind of the economic base of Communist Party rule. And private business has no voice. Private business has no political voice in China. And a lot of the problems that China has today derive from that very fact.
Thank you. I think that's a great point. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to conclude with, but for those who are listening, if you have any questions at any point, please just put them in the Q&A box and I will get to them shortly. On that economic piece, you mentioned again, sort of who has a voice in the economy and at the table on the economic side. And when it comes to domestic policy, economics is clearly such an important driver. I mean, particularly after Tiananmen, and that was sort of the direction that China went in. How do you assess the current economic situation, and how is that affecting domestic policy, foreign policy, all of Xi's ambitions?
Well, that is really, that question is front and center right now, because there's a lot of disappointment that the post-COVID recovery has been pretty feeble in China. It hasn't been what people expected it would be. And economists are debating why that is the case. And some of the reasons are structural, sectoral. They would have happened no matter what, like the demography issues, the fact that the working age population is a smaller proportion of the public now, right? And China had these decades with all these able-bodied young and middle-aged workers, which really gave a boost to its economic growth engine. But now we have more, the population is aging. Of course, the one-child family policy going back to Mao, that was another classic example of arbitrary decisions that were harmful to China in the end. But then some of the problems in the economy today are self-inflicted. And I think there are many people in China who realize that. So in a sense, they're kind of blaming Xi Jinping and his team for making mistakes. Certainly the crackdown on the private sector before zero COVID, I mean, really beginning 2015, then continuing the destruction of the after-school tutoring industry, the attack on the internet companies, really alarmed private business. You've seen major capital flight, private entrepreneurs leaving China, or at least sending their families overseas. So there are a lot, and the real estate bubble. The real estate bubble is clearly the result of policy failures, and also the fact that they have not been able to introduce taxes to put local governments on a fiscal foundation. Local governments are going broke, and the costs they had to absorb to keep zero COVID lockdowns going, all this testing and everything added to that problem. And now the local governments are broke. And if you look at the bond markets, my colleague Victor Shirk keeps me up on all this. And, they have local government fiscal problems, really. Local government debt is very serious. So they're more constrained fiscally now. And so what does that mean? Some people are saying we've reached peak China. I don't see that China's economy will decline. It will continue to grow because there's still a lot of untapped demand in China, especially in the smaller cities. But it's not going to grow as fast. And it's going to have to make choices, or are they going to put money into social goods, education, health, pensions, which are they really haven't done that yet in China. Are they going to do that, which of course will be a way to sustain their popular support? Or are they going to spend the money to build up their nuclear capability, other military capabilities, to build like this new city that Xi Jinping is building outside of Beijing? There are a lot of waste of money that Xi is doing, rather than making choices that will actually make him more popular with the public. The other thing that's happening is there's a return to more state control over agriculture, which is kind of shocking to a lot of people, setting requirements for how much land has to be cultivated in food, because they are worried about food security. She is using this belief, stirring up the belief that America is suppressing and containing China, and actually America is provoking the possibility of war with China. So security dominates development, and even in agriculture.
Thank you for that deep dive on those questions. And for those of you who are interested in the economic piece, we had a good discussion with Yukon Huang. So Brian, if you wouldn't mind putting a link in the chat, that would be great. Thank you. One final question before I turn to the Q&A box, because I see a lot of questions coming in. What advice would you give to policymakers with regards to China's escalating overreach? How do you, what if you were back in your old role, what would you like to be seeing happening right now?
Well, I have been somewhat critical of Biden administration China policy, even though most of the people involved in it are old friends of mine who I respect very much. But I think that America is overreacting to China's overreach, and that we are becoming more like China in that we're politicizing our own market economy. We're putting all these restrictions around our market, embargoes on US technology to Chinese firms. Some of this probably is essential for national security reasons, and I do support a lot of the restrictions related to advanced semiconductors. But what worries me is that in the name of national security, we're allowing these restrictions to spread to a lot of other technology areas. We are extending it to restrictions on visas for students and researchers from China. I mean, this is the part that I certainly, as a university professor, see the most close up and that I'm the most concerned about, because think about what are America's real asymmetric advantages. And the first thing you'll say is talent, the ability of America to attract talented individuals from around the world, because we have a relatively open immigration policy and because we have great universities that people want to come study at. And what we see now is that this fear of China as a security threat is causing us to discourage through administrative means that the Trump administration imposed and the Biden administration hasn't lifted against researchers from China. And it's just put, the other thing this has done is to put all ethnic Chinese, in fact, all Asian Americans, under a cloud of suspicion, racial bias, violence in the streets. And a lot of this comes from an overly inflamed, extreme approach to China as a threat. So I think we should be more thoughtful and sensible about how we weigh the costs and benefits. I mean, look at the sanctions, the Trump sanctions. Why do we still have the Trump sanctions in place? They are costly to American economy, including consumers. So it really doesn't make sense. And yet there's this kind of inflamed fear of China threat now that we see from both parties, but especially more Republicans than Democrats, but both parties. So I really think it's time for more traditional diplomacies. Let's try to integrate sanctions into a diplomatic strategy. You know, in other words, threaten them if China doesn't moderate its behavior and only impose them if they don't change in some way. But I think to simply whack them just destroys any motivation that Chinese decision makers have to moderate their policies, because they believe that no matter what they do, we're going to punish them.
I think a very important and valuable point. Thank you for everything so far. We have a lot of great questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to turn to them now. And again, if you're listening and would like to ask a question, please just put it in the Q&A box. Our first one, the questioner writes, Dr. Jessica Chen Weiss wrote in Foreign Affairs, the March 2023 issue, that the frequency of China's involvement in militarized interstate disputes declined when domestic unrest increased. On the whole, in other words, Chinese leaders have done the opposite of what many analysts are warning. They have sought to reduce external tensions in order to tackle domestic challenges from a position of greater strength, while attempting to deter foreign efforts to exploit internal tensions. How do you respond to this point of view? And what might this approach bode for the situation in regards to Taiwan and the United States?
Well, that is really a wonderful article by Jessica Chen Weiss, who I'm proud to say was my student at UC San Diego and one of my great colleagues now. And yes, what she's saying is there's very little evidence of what international relations scholars call diversionary war foreign policy from China. So as the Chinese economy goes on the ropes, will we see a more aggressive China or a less aggressive China? It's a pretty important question to consider. And what Jessica is saying is, on balance, the odds are that we'll see a less aggressive China that focuses more on domestic considerations, domestic issues. And that, of course, is sort of the whole story of restraint and reassurance up to the mid-2000s. So they wanted to create a good international environment to focus on the domestic economy. And so I think there is a chance that that would be the direction that they would go in if we could use our diplomatic smarts, our alliances and partnerships that now the Biden administration has done a great job of restoring those, and try to nudge China away from the brink of a more aggressive policy.
Thank you. Next question. So just about an hour ago, Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was at the Council on Foreign Relations, and apparently, and again, did not watch the conversation, so can't verify this, but I think it's a good question regardless. So apparently, Secretary Blinken said that the U.S. pursues "quote unquote" peaceful coexistence with China, and outgoing CFR President Richard Haass apparently said that he suspects that the word means a similar relationship between that the US and the Soviet Union had during the Cold War era. How do you interpret this kind of characterization of US-China relations? And how do you believe the United States and China can coexist peacefully?
Well, we have to coexist peacefully. I mean, the fact that talking about coexisting with China peacefully is politically controversial just blows my mind. I mean, I can understand why Richard Haass would mention that it's a phrase that comes from the Cold War, but that doesn't mean the relationship with China is exactly the same as the one we had with the Soviet Union. And of course, this is the greatest challenge to both countries, to our foreign policy makers, to our publics, everybody. We have to figure out how to get along with another very large, powerful country with a very different political system. You know, what's really important? What's important is that we manage to coexist. We manage to work together on global threats, and that neither of us really deprives the other of an active international role if it's peaceful. And it seems to me the US can handle that. We've been doing this for years with countries with different political systems, not just with the Soviet Union, but many other countries as well.
Thank you. The next question is, they write, to some, it looks as though China, Russia, and Iran are coalescing into a bloc united against the United States. How do you see these relationships evolving? What's your view on these relationships?
Well, I think that's correct. I mean, one of the reasons I'm critical of our policy is I think we have not designed a diplomatic strategy toward China that would induce it to recognize that its own interests are to maintain good relations with Russia. It's a neighbor. They really have to do that. But to also to work together with the United States. I mean, from the standpoint of China, a constructive relationship with the United States should be considered a core interest. It's so essential to China. And so we have to, some people would say, well, then what we have to do is kind of put a wedge between China and Russia, which is basically true. Look back to the Cold War, how long it took us to recognize that it was possible to do that. And so we shouldn't do it in a crude manner, but we should encourage China to see that if it acts in a peaceful and constructive manner, we're open to working together with China. So, I mean, look, Russia invaded Ukraine. And Putin trapped Xi Jinping into this statement of friendship without limit. We, on the other hand, shared intelligence with China about Putin's plans, which was actually one of the very bold and positive things that the Biden administration did. It was quite gutsy. And yet Xi Jinping, because he's felt internationally isolated by his own actions, the only person who came to pay a call on him before the Olympics was Putin. So it's like his only buddy. They have this bromance. So, but there are many other people in China who think it is a mistake for China to have this kind of friendly neutrality toward Russia. And there's a lot of internal debate inside China on the internet about this.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you for that. We have a question here, and they write, do you consider the years 2015 to 2018, are these years where I think China switched from more of a Realpolitik approach toward an ideological rivalry with the West? And I find this an interesting question. I'm just going to preface this as well, because in a lot of the discussions we've had about China, one of the common themes that emerges is people will say, well, it's different, than, let's say, Soviet Union, as we were talking about before, because China doesn't have an ideological approach. So very curious to hear your thoughts on this question.
No, Xi Jinping has definitely ramped up ideological loyalty as the key factor in domestic politics. And he really is the first leader of China, post-Mao leader, to celebrate the Chinese system, a China model. Westerners talked about a China model, right? And compared it to the Washington consensus, the Beijing consensus, but Chinese didn't do that, because actually they admired a lot about the West. And also they didn't want to arouse the defensiveness of the West. They didn't want to look like they were criticizing us that way. So they were pretty subtle about it, but not Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping has really come out and said, the Chinese system is superior. We're started in at the 19th Party Congress talking about China being the center of the world. So that kind of systemic rivalry or ideological rivalry then was picked up by the United States. And, Americans, we love our democracy despite its flaws. And so when somebody says their autocratic system is better than American democracy, we don't take that well. And so our policy has become quite ideological too. And that's not a good way to get to compromises that will be necessary for peaceful coexistence.
Great, thank you. And just as a reminder to those listening, we have that this is because it's part of the deep dives. We have another 15 minutes of the conversation, so I hope you can stay with us. Another question, someone asked about Chinese soft power, and they ask, what do you think about China's, the Confucius Institutes? Can we view them as a part of the rising strategy of China? And how do target and context, how does that approach matter when it comes to opening these institutes or classrooms in foreign countries?
The Confucius Institutes we never had one at UC San Diego. There was one at Cal State San Diego and in other schools in California. I've spoken at many Confucius Institutes, and I have to say that there was a kind of political caution in these institutes about what they could teach about China. Meaning that I would always say, well, I'm happy to speak about Chinese domestic trends or US-China relations. And they always went for US-China relations rather than domestic trends. And so they really didn't, they were under the Ministry of Education. They wanted to be kind of in line with the Chinese thinking on these things. But their main purpose was to provide teachers to teach Chinese language. And for many schools that didn't have other resources, it was the one method they could use to teach Chinese, which was great. So I'd say that they weren't completely neutral. But on the other hand, were they a huge risk to the American way of life and to intellectual freedom? No. But I think so I think there would have been ways, and there still are ways if we wanted to do it, to have the university administration protect the intellectual freedom by having a faculty committee that reviews the Confucius Institutes. But instead, American politicians picked it up and used it as a kind of symbol of the China threat to the United States. So to me, it's an example of overreaction. But on the other hand, I think it's a relatively minor issue compared to a lot of other issues.
Thank you. Next question. If the Chinese Communist Party believes that the United States China policy is hostage to American nationalistic impulses, can it also be asked if Xi Jinping's control over China's establishment, is it firm enough to enable him to deal with the nationalist emotions that the CCP has appeared to rely on over the past several years to legitimize its continuing rule?
Oh, great question. Great question. Well, I do think that Xi Jinping feels the same kind of, or if not more, political insecurity than his predecessors did. And that might sound really paradoxical because here he is, he managed to get a third term, he surrounded himself in the standing committee by his loyalists, as you mentioned earlier. So, he should be riding high and feel on top of the world. But I think he's continues to be very nervous about threats to his power. Of course, we saw the protests in the aftermath of zero COVID lockdowns. that was a shock to him, as it was to many of the rest of us. So the threats to a Chinese leader come from two directions. One is the possibility of a public split in the leadership, a kind of coup or intervention from discontented leaders at the top who are not satisfied with Xi Jinping's style of leadership. And I'd say the risk of that remains very high because there's no power sharing. Now, the surveillance of one another, the rules against coordinating behavior with one another make it very difficult to organize a coup. Xi has tried to coup-proof himself, including by taking over direct personal control of the military. So it wouldn't be easy to do it. But I think what we see in Russia today, that if a few influential leaders go public with a critique of Xi Jinping, what happens next is not clear. The way I often think about this is I can't predict what will happen, but when it happens, I won't be surprised. On the other hand, public unrest, I think by and large, the public has remained behind Xi Jinping up through 3 miserable years of zero COVID. But the collapse of zero COVID, those protests in a number of Chinese cities, and the economic problems that are festering now, including youth unemployment, that's kind of a wild card too. But I think that risk is lower than the risk of elite division. And then the question is about nationalist sentiment and whether or not actually what could happen is nationalist young people or out of work college graduates, they might turn on Xi Jinping if they believe he isn't tough enough, say on a new Taiwan president who'll be elected next winter. So nationalism still becomes a very important factor, both manipulated by Xi Jinping himself, something he can use, but something that his critics might use as well.
Thank you. I'll try to get into just a couple more questions. One, what are your thoughts on China's intention and ability to push global de-dollarization?
They can impose the use of renminbi, Chinese currency, for trade. And that has happened, to quite a wide scale degree. But to turn the renminbi into a reserve currency where governments, states want to risk putting their money in renminbi, I'd say, given the uncertainties about China's future, that's going to be very difficult to achieve. People are not going to have the confidence in the Chinese system to put their reserves in renminbi.
Perhaps in some respects, it's more of a question of how the United States handles its own domestic policy over the next few years.
Yeah, but, I mean, people might diversify a little bit more, but not into renminbi. I don't see that happening.
One final question. We had a question about, what your outlook is for the next 10 years. And I'd like to just kind of take a twist on that and say, when it comes to, because I know people don't like to be asked to look into a crystal ball. But when it comes to this idea of overreach and where you see Xi taking China, what are some key signals that you're looking for? What are things that, as a long time, analyst of China, or would help you understand what direction China's going in?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I think the future of the next decade is really very uncertain and very unpredictable because of the nature of the Xi regime, because of the problems that they face domestically now. And, in the past, we could be confident that China's leaders would pragmatically adjust their policies in China's national interests, especially their development interests, economic development interests. Xi has acted rashly. He's been a risk taker. And so we can't count on that anymore. And I think that's, the China threat looms much larger because of that, because of how this system works now. Concentrated, more dictatorial system. But there's still a lot of human agency here. So just as I would never have predicted the U-turn that China has made toward overreach and toward this more concentrated system, I thought that economic modernization was going to lead to continued loosening, not necessarily electoral democracy, but China would continue moving in that direction. And I think many people in China believe that. But so I can't predict what will happen in the next decade. What I am, however, we haven't gotten to talking about Taiwan. And I think the reason we are more worried about a military attack on Taiwan today than we've been previously is because we can't count on Xi Jinping's prudence the way we could count on the prudence of previous leaders. And so we need to watch what kind of real military preparations are underway in China. We need to look for other signals in order to predict that. But also we need to be prudent and not change our policy toward cross-strait relations in a way that provokes Xi into military action against Taiwan. And some of these symbolic ideas that Congress plays around with are really dangerous. So we could provoke exactly the outcome of war in the Taiwan Strait that we're seeking to prevent.
On that rather ominous note, I think we will draw to a conclusion. Professor Shirk, thank you so much. This has been an incredible hour plus. I think I can speak for everyone who is listening when I say, we've all benefited tremendously from your knowledge. So thank you for taking the time to share it. Just a few housekeeping notes for those who are listening. We're trying to take it a little bit easier over the summer as we prepare for our fall season, but we do have a few member-only events, including an in-person event in New York City with Elizabeth Shackelford on the militarization of U.S. foreign policy. So that's Tuesday, July 18th. If you're in the area and would like to attend, please reach out to us. We'd love to have you. And then a virtual member-only discussion on the regional realignment in the Middle East with Sanam Vakil. So We have those coming up, and you'll be hearing more about what we'll be doing in the fall shortly. And again, we are a nonprofit. We really rely on donations. So if you have it in your hearts and wallets to support us, we would greatly appreciate it. So thank you. With that, Professor Shirk, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for the great conversation. Really appreciate the opportunity and would love to hear what people think about my book.
Yes, absolutely. 100% would be great. We'll send any feedback we hear your way too.
Okay.
Thank you. Take care.